Hi guys, it's Julian Kopensky, aka Kill You for Run It Once, with my next video. The topic of this video will be exploiting folding tendencies of regulars at my stakes. We will be analyzing my database from the past year, trying to find different spots in which my opponents are overfolding, and we will be using hand to note for this purpose, especially a range research feature. So in this software, we are able to create a cumulated pop-up for a lot of opponents, which we can filter on based on some criteria. So for example, here I will state that our opponent should be a regular and his FIB should be less than 21, PFR less than 16. So this will guarantee that opponent which fits into this category is regular, and then this formula means that the when to showdown of our opponent is less than 26, so 25 and all below. I will do the same researches for different when to showdown stats, and then we will compare folding frequencies in different spots and how the folding frequency correlate with when to showdown stat. So this is a cumulated pop-up for opponents which have when to showdown less than 26. Let's start with analyzing the situation when our opponent was the pre-flop aggressor, and let's find spots in which he is overfolding. What we can see here is that when our opponent was out of position, on average they are check folding 61%. And this stat is quite high, and if, for example, we will bet one half of the pot in position, then we need 33%, but on average we will have 61, so this means that we should be betting in position very frequently, and with merged range probably trying to take down equity of our opponent and to set up spots for the future bluffs. Then we see that if our opponent check call flop, and he is facing a bet on the turn, they are folding only 46. This is closer to optimal strategy, and this means that playing bet flop, bet turn, and then give up river is not a very profitable strategy. And if we want to be bluffing turn, then we should be continuing rivers with some reasonable frequency, because on the river this kind of opponents is once again overfolding and folding more than optimal. On average they are folding 61. If they was pair far pre-flop, then they check call flop OP, check call turn, and then they check fold at the river 61%. Another interesting stat is that if our opponent face an overbet on the turn, they are folding 74%. However, if, for example, we are using 150% sizing, it's enough for us to have only 60% fold equity, while on average we will have 74, and still we will be able to continue bluffing the rivers, and we will have some equity to improve. So our overbets on the turn in position should be super profitable in this spot versus this kind of opponents. Now let's try to compare just these three stats against opponents which have a little bit higher when to showdown. So in this case we are analyzing some average when to showdown stat. And what we see here is the same. They are usually overfolding flop, and it's still profitable to bet in position on the flop with a wide range and high frequency, probably using smaller sizing, something like half pot. But then on the turn, these opponents are check folding even less than the previous ones, and also at the river they are not overfolding too much. So it's not very profitable to triple barrel in this spot. However, they are still check folding turn versus overbets with a very big frequency, and this is obviously exploitable and profitable to bet here. And now let's look at the opponents which are super station happy, and we see that these opponents are even not check folding flop too much, and we are not printing money by instantly betting flop in position. So we need to be a little bit more picky about our hands, and maybe bluff with some backdoor draws or some potential to improve. And on the later streets they are also not check folding much. So this means that in this situation the correlation with when to showdown stat work perfectly fine, and the higher the when to showdown is, the less our opponent fold. And if we are planning to make a bluff, it's quite useful to check our opponent when to showdown and then check his folding stats. And this sentence that I'm saying, I will be repeating a lot in this video because I'm trying to show you that it's quite useful to carefully pick opponent versus which we are trying to make our bluff. And versus some opponents we should be under bluffing, versus other we should be over bluffing a lot. Okay, let's put our data into this table. Here it was something like 61, here it was 60, and here 44. Now let's see what happened if our opponent makes a c-bet out of position. In this case, we see that on average opponents are c-betting 51% while they're OOP, and then checking on the turn in 51%, and then check folding 62. So once we get in a spot that opponent check to us on the turn, it's once again quite profitable to bet in position. But when we are considering a floating option on the flop, we need to be a little bit cautious about our hand selection and about the spot in general, because it's not guaranteed that opponent will check fold versus our bet, and also he might c-bet himself on the turn. So I make a simple sim for this spot. And in this case, we are holding ace-queen on the 10-7 free board. Our opponent made a c-bet on the flop, and then he's c-betting 50% of the times on the turn and check folding 60 versus our float. And we see that in this case, we are losing one big blind, but it's in a scenario when the turn doesn't improve us. So if we change that the turn is unknown, and if we will make that we are calling with at least a pair, I think that our float will become profitable on the flop. So yeah, now our float is slightly profitable. But what I'm trying to show you with this sim, that even if opponent is not c-betting very often on the turn out of position, only 50%, and check folding quite high, 60, our float with bare overcards is still not very profitable. And for example, if we will make his c-betting frequency a little bit higher, for example, let's say 55, and decrease his folding frequency a bit, let's say 50, then our floats will become break even. Okay, now let's look how our opponents check folding turns with different when to showdown stats. So average opponents are check folding 55 and c-betting turn 53. It's closer to our last sim. And those station opponents are check folding only 50 and c-betting a little bit less. So in general, it looks like still if we have some kind of a draw on the flop, gut shot, or maybe some backdoor flush draw, then we could float versus most of our opponents, and this should show a small profit. Now let's look at the same spot, but if our opponent is in position. And tight opponents are if they missed flop c-bet, so they make a PFR and then check on the flop in position, they are folding 60 on the turn and 52 at the river. The river frequency is not too exploitable, and to continue bluffing river, we should probably pick our weakest draw with least showdown value. And for example, if it was a flush draw and some open-enders on the flop, then probably we should bluff without flush blockers. So not bluff all of our combos, but on the turn it's quite profitable to step with almost all of our bluffs, because once again, if for example we will be betting 66% of the pot on the turn, which I think is quite standard sizing, we only something like 40%, I think. Yeah, it's 39% full equity, and we still will have some equity left. And we see that versus those tight opponents, it's very profitable to step out of position. Versus average opponents, it's less profitable to continue bluffing river, but still profitable to step turn. And versus station opponents, we should select good draws in our range to start bluffing the turn, and then probably bluff river with optimal frequency or even a little bit less than optimal. and continue bluffing only into really good cards for our range, into some scary cards. So for example, if a flush hits and we have a missed gut shot, probably we could continue bluffing there. And another thing which I want to show you in this spot is the fold versus overbet. So if we are out of position and our opponent checked in position, then on the turn he will fold 83%, and this is once again too high. As I explained you a little bit earlier, we need only 60% fold equity to make a 150% bet on the turn, and they are folding 84, so it's super profitable to make some overbet bluffs. And average opponents also folding a lot versus overbets, 79, and station opponents, and even station opponents are folding much. So maybe versus those station opponents we should be using large sizing for value, because they are quite station and they want to call us down, and we should use large sizing with good draws, because we want to put some pressure on them and we want to be balanced and not do overbets just for value in that scenario. Okay, now let's put some data in our Excel file. So bet, check, fold, and check in position and then fold. Here it was 60, 44, and something like 59, I think. And here it was 62, 56, and 50. So we still see a very good correlation between when to showdown and folding in almost all of the spots. So the higher the when to showdown of the opponent is, the less profitable it is to bluff versus him. And why I'm playing around when to showdown? Because this stat is quite reliable even when we have not too much sample size on our opponent. Let's say if we have 4k or 5k hands, we cannot have much spots like this. For example, if he bet and then check fold turn, it might be 5 spots or 7 spots in this scenario, but we will have a quite good sample size on his when to showdown, and then knowing when to showdown stat, we can make approximation and make some assumptions about his folding stats in different spots. Another profitable spot to bet is once our opponent bet in position, then check, and then we bet at the river. We see that tight opponents are folding 71%. This is super high, and but the same as with the floating in position. We need to be a little bit cautious about trying to exploit this stat, because we will not very often be able to get here. Because usually in position, betting frequencies of our opponents a little bit higher, especially if this is good mid-stakes opponents. I think that they might be c-betting turn something like 60-65%, and if we was floating without some equity, and if we didn't hit the turn, then we should be folding, and the EV of our float OP will drop quite high, because of the fact that we did not get to the situation where we will be able to bluff. On the other hand, for example, if opponent check on the turn, then we are right here and we can make a profitable bet like right here. We do not depend on any action, his actions on future streets, and we can make a profitable bet right here. But what's interesting about this fold in position, that we might use it even if we was check calling flop with some medium strength showdown value. So for example, let's say opponent raised from middle position, we cold call with pocket tens from the big blind, and flop came ace 8. I will put it here to make it a little bit more visual. So it was 8-8 deuce, and then let's say on the turn hit a king, and we are still with pocket tens, and our opponent decided to check back turn. And here I think it's quite a good spot to turn our pocket tens into a bluff, or for example 8-7 or 8-9 if we are calling this pre-flop, because sometimes our opponent could c-bet queens or jacks on the flop, sometimes he will hit king x on the flop, sometimes if we check the river again he will decide to bluff or value bet thinly and take off of our hand, and in this spot we will not have too many natural bluffs, because if we was floating out of position with something like king queen, king jack suited, then we hit something with ace, we obviously not bluffing. Only natural floats might be something like 10-9 with the backdoor flush draw or something like this. And if we know that opponent is folding a lot to river probe, then we probably should be turning our weakest made hands into bluff. So we are not floating, for example, queen 10 suited on the flop intentionally to make a bluff with the river, but we are check calling mediocre hand with a possibility to win its showdown sometimes, and sometimes we will be able to turn this into bluff and make a profitable bet at the river. Now let's compare another opponents in the same spot. So average opponent is folding 66 versus river probe, a little bit lower, and those station opponents are folding only 59. So versus them, it's definitely not worth it to float out of position with a total air, because sometimes we'll get barreled from our float, and in quite high frequency, 40%, we will get called at the river, and our river bet itself won't make so much profit. Another thing which you want to analyze is bet fold on the flop. Let's start from the tightest opponents, and we saw that they are bet folding 51 in position while they are in position, and 53 while they are out of position. And for example, if a pot on the flop was 10 big blinds and opponent bet 5, and we decided to raise to 15, then this is exactly the amount of fold equity we need to make a break-even bluff raise. But usually when we are raising, we will have some kind of additional equity, or we will be able to bluff on the future streets. So versus these opponents, it's quite okay-ish to bluff raise flops. Versus average opponents, raising is not super profitable on the flop, because 35 is not letting us make instant profit on the flop by raising. And knowing that when the showdown is not very low, this means that they might be a little bit happier to call us down on later streets. And those station opponents are bet folding even less, only 42. So versus them, we should be check raising with some strong draws such as open-enders, flush draws, and etc. Now I want to look how tight opponents are reacting to turn raise. And if they was betting out of position and now they continue betting once again on OP, they are folding 58. You can see it here, and they are basically never free betting, only 5%. So they will usually fold or call, and this means that we can even raise our semi-bluffs on the turn, not being afraid of getting shoved and to lose our equity if we have to fold versus a jam on the turn. And this is quite profitable spot to raise, especially once again with additional equity. It's super profitable. And if our opponent was in position, then fold equity is a little bit lower, it's 51. Average opponents in this spot are folding 41. It's quite strange. I think that maybe it's a little bit not so frequent spot, and this might be not enough sample to look at this start, because based on my feeling, I think that opponents are folding more often than this 41. And if they were in position, they are folding 47. So probably they are folding a little bit more than 41 out of position, because it's illogical to fold more in position than out of position. It's easier for them to get value if they had a draw, for example, in position, but if they are out of position, they should donk or wait for us to bluff. Maybe it's a little bit not enough sample here. And however, we see that station opponents are bet folding only 30%, and it's super not profitable to bluff raise them on the turn, and we should go just for value because they are stationed and they allow to pay money to see the showdowns, and in position also folding only 38. But still not jamming, however they are jamming 15. It's quite high, and I will not be raising draws which don't like to get jam on the turn, but still have something like 20-24% equity. I would rather call with them and then try to hit at the river, and probably not bluff if I do not hit, based on the stat of the opponents. So it's we can exploit the stats of our opponents in different ways. It's not only the way that we should bluff a lot, and this is the exploitation. This is the exploitation against those tight opponents. So we are bluffing a lot versus them, and we are over bluffing and making profit from this. But versus station opponents, we can also exploit them by not bluffing much. And for example, on average, if we will be bluffing a lot versus tight opponents, bluffing not much versus station opponents, we will still look like a Rex who sometimes makes a bluff. So it will be hard for station opponents to fold all the time versus us. First of all, because they don't like to fold, and second of all, because our stats looks like we are bluffing, because we are bluffing versus tight opponents. However, tight opponents will not know that we are over bluffing much, because we are not bluffing versus when to show down happy opponents versus station opponents. So our stats will look balanced. However, we will play totally different strategies versus different opponents. Okay, now let's move to the spot when our opponent was a cold caller pre-flop, and we saw that if opponent was out of position, and they check call flop, check call turn, and now they are check folding 55% at the river. And for example, if we are using 75% sizing at the river, which is quite standard, we need only something like 43-44%, and our bluffs will generate instant profit versus these tight opponents. And this is quite common spot to be in with a quite weak range at the river once you check call twice, because usually you will want to check raise your strong hands on the flop or on the turn, and if you check call both streets, then usually at the river you are just with the pure bluff catcher, and with bluff catcher it's not always easy to call the third bullet, and it's quite a good spot to make a bluff on our side, especially versus those tight opponents, and this folding frequency is a little bit too high. Another spot is overbetting the turn. Tight opponents are folding 73 versus turn overbets. This is once again too high, and we can use this and then continue river with the pot size or with the jam. Medium opponents are folding a little bit less at the river, but still it's quite profitable to bluff versus them at the river, especially if we will select our hands to bluff right, using the worst showdown, the hands with worst showdown value, so for example 8 high or something like this, or bluffing with an missed open-ender if it was a flush draw possible and open-ended possible, but both of the draws miss. I would usually bluff with a hands without flush draw cards, because this will generate a little bit higher fold equity. I will not look much on this stat that opponents are folding 58 versus third barrel when they was in position. Probably this category is a little bit too narrow, from 55 from 25 to 28, and maybe not so much players and not so much hands in this category, and this is the case why sometimes stats are a little bit not normal and not logical in this category. It's the same category which was bet folding less out of position than in position. So it's another great spot to bluff is a third barrel in position. Versus station opponents, not so profitable. As always, they don't like to fold, and if they was in position, the frequency is super low, and probably we should not be bluffing here at all. Now let's look at the situation when our opponent cold call a free bet. And once again, a third barrel at the river, but when they called a free bet, and if they are out of position. It's very common spot to overfold, because usually when you were out of position pre-flop, you will sometimes forbet your strong hands pre-flop, like kings, queens, aces, and you will check raise your sets or your overpairs on the flop or on the turn quite frequently, because you don't want scare cards to hit, you don't want to miss value from overpairs of your opponent, and usually you will end up with a quite weak range of bluff catchers at the river, and opponents are quite frequently overfolding versus third barrel in 3-bet pot out of position. In position, this stat is quite normal, even for tight opponents. Average opponents are folding a little bit closer to optimal, but still, if we was betting flop and turn with some equity, our bets was profitable, and on some river textures, on some good cards to bluff, we should consider jamming versus them, because still our bluffs will make some profit versus these average opponents, knowing their folding frequency, versus station opponents is, as always, bad to bluff in this spot also. Now let's analyze a situation when our opponent was a free better pre-flop, and we saw that even tight opponents are not check folding much in free bet pots, while in single raise pots they was check folding 60, in free bet pots they are check folding 51, and it's close to optimal frequency, especially knowing the fact that they are c-betting quite frequently. So the check spot is not very often and very likely scenario in this situation. And when they check call the flop, they are not folding too much at the turn, but folding a lot at the river. This is about tight opponents. And we saw that they are check raising 70% after check calling the flop. This means that probably opponents are sometimes check calling flop with some sets or overpairs, and then on a safe turn they are check jamming, trying to induce our bluffs to get value from our draws. Once again, check call in the free bet pot as a pre-flop aggressor is a not very weak line, because usually it's easier to to bet with air or with a bluff in free bet pot, and if they check, then usually they have something like medium pair or top pair or whatever. Now average opponents are not folding much on any of the streets, while they were 3-betters pre-flop and they are out of position. So here I'm trying to show you that bluffing in position versus missed c-bet in a free bet pot is not super profitable idea versus most opponents. But what's a little bit interesting here is a line: if our opponent was a free better pre-flop, then bet and then check at the river. Then even average opponents are check folding 80. And it's quite reasonable, because usually if you're out of position with a strong hand at the river in free bet pot, you don't want to bluff catch, because it's not so many draws in free bet pots, and usually draws might raise flop or turn. And if opponent was calling you 2 times, then probably he is on a bluff catcher, and you want to jam river for value. And also people do not expect too often for their opponents to make double float in a free bet pot and then jam the river with a bluff. So people are check folding 80%. This is about average opponents. Tight opponents are also check folding 80. And station opponents, even station opponents, are check folding enough for us to make a profitable jams at the river in this spot. It's a little bit hard for us to get to this spot, because our opponents are c-betting quite high. What I mean is that they are betting 50% turn and 50% at the river. So it's not very profitable to trying to get intentionally to this scenario where we could jam the river without any equity or without any chances to improve. But for example, if we have open-ender, flush draw, or some medium pair, maybe pair plus gut shot, we could considering calling the turn once again and we should understand that we sometimes will get into spot where we could make a profitable jam at the river. But we need to be a little bit accurate with this double floating, because it weakens our turn calling range, and probably we will fold quite often versus a third barrel. And if we are folding a lot versus third barrel, then our opponent could jam lighter at the river, especially with the bluffs, and this will decrease the EV of our floats. So we cannot be super crazy there. And once again, what we should be considering is turning some weak made hands into a bluff if we get with them to the river and opponent check to us. So for example, we raised ace-10 suited from ace-10 of clubs from the button, and opponent 3-bet us from the small blind. And let's say the flop was queen 10 deuce. We decided to make a call on the flop. It's quite standard. On the turn the card was blank, 7 hearts, and here on the turn quite standard option will be to fold, but for some reason we made a call on the turn. For example, we know that our opponent is not third barreling very often, so we saw that his river continuation bet is 50 or 45, and we understand that we still have some showdown value. We might win versus ace queen, versus ace king, versus king jack, some flush draws, 8-9, and we decided to call here. And we know that our range will be protected with some queen x, some flush draws, some king jacks, some jack 9 in our range, and on different rivers it will be not so easy for our opponent to value bet even with ace queen, for example. And the river, let's say, is 8 of diamond, for example. And now if our opponent check, it should be super profitable in our shoes to jam ace-10 of club. So we was calling turn not very intentionally to make a bluff at the river, but the river develops in such a way that now we are at the bottom of our range, and we need to turn some made hands into bluff to have some bluffs in our range, and because we know that opponents are check folding very often at the river. Obviously, if the river will be 4 of spade and opponent check, it's not super awesome spot to bluff, because he even could check call us with pocket jacks, because a lot of draw missed, and we are not taking him off any better hands, and we could safely check back here, and sometimes with a showdown. So you should consider turning some hands into bluff versus bet check line in a 3-bet pot. Another bonus spot in which opponents are overfolding is if opponents called in position and they do not bet on the flop. So on the flop we check and they check behind, and now we see that they play check and then fold in position in 63%. And once again, if you get to this spot, it's super profitable to bet basically with any hand. For example, we raised pocket deuces and get called by middle position, and the flop came, I don't know, king 10 3, the turn is 7, and it's profitable to bet our deuces and then maybe even continue bluffing at the river, especially if the river is good for our range. So in this spot, tight opponents are overfolding, average opponents are still folding a lot, and versus loose opponents, it's not a good spot to bluff. Basically, there are no good spots to bluff versus these loose opponents. And also another bonus spot is if our opponent called out of position and then flop was check and our opponent checks again at the river. Tight opponents are folding, check folding 64%. Once again, it's very profitable to step here even with a single bluff bet and not continuing at the river. It's not very profitable to bet turn, for example, if let's say a flop was 10-7 deuce and then a king came on the turn, because our opponents will be usually checking their whole range and they will be looking to make a check raise with a lot of draws, a lot of two-pair combos, sets, and it's not super profitable, for example, to bet pocket fours here. And we could sometimes even check behind something like king jack or king 9, knowing that we usually will get check raised. But for example, if the board is the same and we know that we could pot control in position something like even ace 10, jack 10, queen 10 sometimes, 9s, 8s, and for example then e6 came on the turn, and we are holding, let's say, queen jack of hearts, or even 5. Okay, let's say 5 came in the turn, and we are holding queen jack of hearts, and our opponent checks again on the turn. It will be quite profitable to step here and make him fold something like ace jack, ace queen, maybe ace 9, pocket 4s, pocket 3s, and even average opponents are still check folding here enough for us to make a profitable bet. So that's it for overfolding spots. I hope that you understand that it's very important to not only look on the board and on your hand, but also choose carefully your opponent, knowing his stats, because this will greatly increase or decrease the EV of your bluff if you choose your opponent right to make a certain play. So thanks for watching, guys. Bye. Waiting for your comments and for your feedback.